The fever took her in 3 days. Ethan Mercer had fought blizzards, bandits, and wild animals across the Colorado frontier, but he couldn't fight the sickness that turned his wife's skin to fire. Clara died whispering a name, her sister's name. Now standing in a cabin that still smells like lavender and loss, Ethan faces a winter more brutal than any storm, complete and utter loneliness. But when a letter arrives from the east months later, everything changes. The woman stepping off that stagecoach looks exactly like the wife he buried, and she's come to stay. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels. The last thing Clara said wasn't, "I love you." It wasn't goodbye. It was a name. Lydia. Her voice barely rose above the wind howling through the gaps in the cabin walls. Ethan Mercer knelt beside their bed, the bed he'd built with his own hands from pine he'd cut himself, and held his wife's hand as the fever burned through her like wildfire through summer grass. Her fingers were so hot they nearly scalded his calloused palm, but he didn't let go. He'd never let go. "Don't," he whispered, though he didn't know what he was asking her not to do. "Don't leave. Don't die. Don't make him face this world alone." But Clara's blue eyes, usually bright as morning sky, had already glazed over with something distant. She was looking past him, through him, at something he couldn't see. Her lips moved again, forming shapes he had to lean close to hear. "Write to Lydia. Promise me. Promise." The word broke off into a cough that rattled her entire body. Ethan supported her shoulders as she shook, feeling how light she'd become, how the sickness had hollowed her out from the inside. When the coughing finally stopped, she collapsed back against the pillow, breathing in short, desperate gasps. "I promise," Ethan said, and he meant it, though he had no idea who this Lydia was or why Clara spent her dying breath on that name instead of on him. Clara smiled then, just a small curve of her cracked lips, and closed her eyes. She never opened them again. That was December 14th, 1878, the worst day of Ethan Mercer's 32 years on this earth. The ground was frozen solid when he tried to dig her grave. Ethan stood in the small clearing behind the cabin, pickaxe in hand, staring down at earth hard as iron. The snow had stopped falling an hour ago, leaving everything blanketed in white silence. Even the ravens had gone quiet. The whole mountain seemed to be holding its breath. He swung the pickaxe. The impact jarred his shoulders, traveled up his arms, rattled his teeth. The frozen ground barely chipped. He swung again, and again, and again. His breath came out in white clouds. Sweat froze on his forehead despite the cold. His hands, even through thick gloves, began to blister. But he kept swinging. What else could he do? Leave her in the cabin to freeze? Take her down the mountain to the town cemetery? A 3-day ride in this weather? No. She loved this spot. She'd stood here just last summer, hands on her hips, surveying the valley below with those bright eyes of hers. "This is where I want to rest someday," she'd said, laughing at his expression. "Not for a long, long time, mind you. But when I'm old and gray, and you're old and grayer, this is where I want to be, where I can see the whole valley, where the aspens turn gold in the fall." He hadn't wanted to talk about death then. She was so alive, so full of plans for their future. They'd only been married 2 years. They were supposed to have decades ahead of them. But the fever didn't care about plans. It took Ethan 6 hours to dig a grave deep enough. By the time he finished, his hands were bleeding inside his gloves, and the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the snow pink and orange. He climbed back up to the cabin, every muscle screaming, and wrapped Clara in their wedding quilt. The one her mother had made. The one she'd brought all the way from Pennsylvania. He carried her down to the grave as the first stars appeared. There was no preacher, no mourners. Just Ethan and the wind and the woman he loved, wrapped in faded cotton and wildflowers he'd somehow found blooming in a sheltered spot by the creek. He should have said something, should have spoken words over her, but what words could possibly be enough? So he just stood there as the darkness gathered, memorizing the shape of her wrapped in that quilt before he lowered her into the frozen earth. The sound of dirt hitting the quilt was the loneliest sound he'd ever heard. The cabin felt enormous without her. Ethan had never noticed how small it was when Clara was alive. She'd filled every corner with her presence, humming while she cooked, reading aloud by the fire, rearranging the furniture every few months just to keep things fresh. Now the silence pressed down on him like a physical weight. His footsteps echoed. The fire crackled too loud. Even his own breathing seemed intrusive. He found the letter 2 days after the burial. It was in Clara's sewing basket, tucked beneath a half-finished embroidery she'd been working on. The envelope was addressed in her careful handwriting. Miss Lydia Hale, 412 Chestnut Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Ethan stared at it for a long moment before he remembered. Lydia, the name Clara had whispered as she died. This was the sister she'd mentioned once or twice, the younger sister she'd left behind when she'd married Ethan and moved west. They'd exchanged letters occasionally, though not as often as Clara had wished. The distance was too great, the mail too unreliable. He opened the letter, even though it felt like a violation. My dearest Lydia, I hope this letter finds you well and happy. Life here in Colorado continues to be everything I dreamed and more. Ethan is the finest man I've ever known, strong and gentle in equal measure. He built me a bookshelf last month, entirely unprompted. He knows how much I miss having proper shelves for my books. The mountains are magnificent, especially now as winter approaches. I wish you could see them, Lydia. I wish you could see this life we've built. You would love it here, I'm certain. The air is so clean it almost hurts to breathe, and the stars at night are so bright you could read by them. I know you're happy in Philadelphia, with your teaching position and your literary society. I know you think I'm mad for choosing this rough frontier life. But there's a freedom here, Lydia, a spaciousness, room to breathe and grow and become whoever you want to be. I do miss you, though, more than I can say. Sometimes I imagine what it would be like if you visited. We could walk through the aspen groves together. I could teach you to ride. We could talk the way we used to before I left. Would you ever consider it? A visit? I mean, even just for a summer? Write to me soon. I miss your letters. All my love, Clara. The letter was dated November 20th, less than a month ago, before the fever came. Ethan read it 3 times, hearing Clara's voice in every word. Then he folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. He had promised to write to Lydia. He had no idea what to say. Plus, winter deepened its grip on the mountain. Ethan moved through his days like a ghost, doing what needed to be done because the alternative was lying down in the snow and never getting up. The animals still needed feeding. The water still needed hauling from the creek, chopped free from ice every morning. The firewood still needed splitting. He did it all in silence. The neighbors, scattered as they were across these mountains, tried to help at first. Mrs. Henderson rode up from her homestead 5 miles south, bringing a pot of stew and a pitying expression Ethan couldn't stand to look at. Tom Garrett stopped by with an offer to help with the spring planting, his hat in his hands, his eyes darting everywhere except Ethan's face. Anything you need, Tom had said. Anything at all. What Ethan needed was his wife back. Since that wasn't possible, what he wanted was to be left alone. He told them all the same thing. I'm managing, but thank you. Eventually, they stopped coming. The letter to Lydia took him 2 weeks to write. He went through 7 drafts, each one feeling more inadequate than the last. How did you tell a woman her sister was dead? How did you explain to a stranger that you'd failed to save the person you loved most in the world? In the end, he kept it simple. Miss Hale, I regret to inform you that your sister, Clara Mercer, passed away on December 14th from fever. She spoke of you at the end and asked that I write to you. She is buried on our homestead, in a spot she loved, overlooking the valley. I am sorry for your loss. Ethan Mercer. He read it over one last time, hating how cold it sounded, how insufficient. But what else could he say? He didn't know this woman. She didn't know him. The only thing they had in common was grief. He sealed the envelope and rode down to town the next day to post it. The trip took 4 hours through snow-packed trails. He delivered the letter to the postmaster, bought supplies he didn't need just to justify the journey, and rode home in the gathering dusk. He didn't expect a reply. What could she possibly say? January passed in a blur of cold and silence. Ethan fell into a routine that kept him moving, but left his mind mercifully blank. Wake before dawn, feed the horses and the cow, chop wood, haul water, Eat something, usually just beans or salt pork, barely tasting it. Chop more wood. Mend the barn roof where the snow had damaged it. Oil the leather tack. Clean the rifle. Sharpen the saw. Fall into bed when it was too dark to work anymore. Sleep, when it came, brought dreams of Clara. Clara laughing, Clara dancing, Clara lying in that bed, her skin burning with fever while he stood helpless. He woke most mornings with his face wet, not sure if it was from tears or melted snow blown through the gaps in the walls. February brought a brief thaw, then another storm that buried the cabin to the windowsills. Ethan dug himself out and went back to work. There was always work. Work kept the thoughts away. He was chopping wood behind the cabin when he heard the horse. At first he thought he'd imagined it. Who would be traveling in this weather? But there it was again, the definite sound of hoofbeats crunching through snow, coming up the trail from the valley. Ethan set down his axe and walked around to the front of the cabin, squinting against the bright March sunlight reflecting off the snow. A single rider was approaching. Too far away yet to make out details, but something about the posture, straight-backed, careful, suggested this wasn't one of his rough-hewn neighbors. He waited, one hand resting on the pistol at his hip out of habit. You didn't survive on the frontier without caution. As the rider drew closer, Ethan's breath caught in his chest. It was a woman. She rode side saddle on a bay mare, wearing a dark traveling dress and a practical wool coat. Her hair was pinned up beneath a modest hat, and she sat her horse like someone who'd learned to ride properly, in a ring, not out on open range. But it was her face that froze Ethan in place. For one impossible moment, he thought Clara had come back from the dead. The same delicate features, the same straight nose and high cheekbones, the same fair hair, though this woman wore hers darker, more honey than gold. The rider pulled her horse to a stop 20 feet from the cabin and looked at him with eyes that were almost, but not quite, the same shade of blue as Clara's. "Mr. Mercer?" Her voice was clear, educated, with the crisp enunciation of the East Coast. "I'm Lydia Hale, Clara's sister." Of course she was. Ethan found his voice somewhere beneath the shock. "Miss Hale, I didn't expect you. I wrote to inform you of my arrival." She dismounted with practiced grace, though he could see her legs trembling slightly as they took her weight. Long ride. "The letter must not have reached you." "No, ma'am. It didn't." He was staring. He couldn't help it. The resemblance was uncanny and terrible. Same bone structure. Same way of tilting her head slightly when she spoke. But where Clara had been warm and open, this woman held herself with careful reserve. Lydia tied her horse to the porch rail and turned to face him fully. Her eyes swept over the cabin, the barn, the snow-covered clearing before returning to him. He saw her taking his measure, the overgrown beard, the hollow eyes, the clothes he probably should have washed a week ago. "I've come to help," she said simply. "Clara asked you to write to me. I assume she wanted me to know about her death, but also—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Also, I think she wanted me to come, to make sure you were managing." "I'm managing." The words came out harsher than he'd intended. Lydia's expression didn't change. "I can see that." Her tone suggested she could see exactly how poorly he was managing. "Nevertheless, I'm here now. I've brought supplies from town. The postmaster was kind enough to direct me. I have my own bedding. I don't intend to be a burden." "How long are you planning to stay?" "As long as necessary." They stood there in the snow, two strangers connected only by the woman they'd both loved and lost, neither quite sure what to say next. Finally, Lydia straightened her shoulders. "It's freezing out here, Mr. Mercer. Might we continue this conversation inside? And perhaps you could help me with my bags. I'm afraid I'm not accustomed to managing them myself." It was a command disguised as a request, delivered with the kind of quiet authority that suggested she was used to being obeyed. Ethan found himself moving to help before he'd consciously decided to. She had 2 large bags and a trunk. As he carried them toward the cabin, he wondered what the hell he'd gotten himself into. This woman had just ridden across half a continent to help a man she'd never met. She'd left whatever life she had in Philadelphia, the teaching position Clara had mentioned, the literary society, the civilized comforts of the East. Why? He pushed open the cabin door, and immediately saw the space through her eyes, the unmade bed, the dishes piled in the wash basin, the layer of dust on every surface, the general air of neglect and despair. Lydia stepped inside behind him and was silent for a long moment. "Yes," she said finally, setting down her traveling bag. "I can see you're managing perfectly well on your own." The sarcasm was gentle, almost kind, but it stung nonetheless. "I'll clean up," Ethan said stiffly. "We'll clean up," Lydia corrected. She was already removing her coat, folding it precisely over the back of a chair. "But first, I'd like to see Clara's grave, if you don't mind." Of course she wanted to see the grave. Ethan nodded and led her back outside, around to the small clearing he'd been avoiding for months. The grave was marked with a simple wooden cross he'd carved himself. No fancy words, just her name and the dates. Clara Mercer, 1854 to 1878. Beloved. Lydia stood at the foot of the grave for a long time, so still she might have been carved from ice herself. Ethan hung back, giving her privacy, watching the way the wind caught loose strands of her hair. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "She loved you very much. Her letters were full of you, Ethan this, Ethan that. She said you were the finest man she'd ever known." The words hit him like a physical blow. "I couldn't save her." No one could have saved her. Fever takes who it wants. Lydia turned to look at him then, and her eyes were dry but infinitely sad. "But you gave her 2 happy years. That's more than many people get in a lifetime." Ethan had no response to that. He'd spent 3 months drowning in guilt, convinced he'd failed Clara somehow. The idea that he'd given her anything good seemed impossible. Lydia knelt in the snow and placed one gloved hand on the frozen earth. "I'm here now, Clara," she whispered. "I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry I didn't come when you invited me. But I'm here now." She stayed there for another minute, her lips moving in silent words Ethan couldn't hear. Then she stood, brushed the snow from her skirt with brisk efficiency, and turned back toward the cabin. "All right," she said. "Let's get to work." Lydia Hale attacked the cabin like a general planning a campaign. Within an hour of arriving, she'd assessed the situation, prioritized the problems, and begun implementing solutions with a ruthless efficiency that left Ethan simultaneously impressed and slightly terrified. She started with the dishes. While Ethan brought in her trunk, she heated water on the stove, located the lye soap, and began scrubbing 3 months' worth of accumulated grime from the plates and pots. She worked in focused silence, her movements precise and economical. "Where does Clara keep—" She stopped herself, closed her eyes briefly. "Where did Clara keep the linens?" "Trunk by the bed." Lydia opened the trunk and pulled out fresh sheets, shaking them out with sharp snaps of fabric. "These will need washing, but they'll do for now. When was the last time the bedding was changed?" Ethan had to think about it. "December, maybe?" "December." Her tone was flat. "It's March, Mr. Mercer." "I know what month it is." "Do you?" She was making up the bed now, tucking the corners with hospital precision. "Because from where I'm standing, it appears you've been living in December for quite some time." The observation was too accurate to argue with. Ethan retreated to the porch to give her space, ostensibly to check on her horse, but really just to escape the whirlwind of activity that had overtaken his life. He unsaddled the bay mare and rubbed her down, finding a strange comfort in the familiar task. The horse was well cared for, her hooves recently trimmed, her coat glossy despite the long journey. Lydia might be an Easterner, but she knew how to treat a horse right. When he came back inside, the cabin had been transformed. The dishes were clean and stacked. The floor had been swept. The windows, grimy enough that he'd barely been able to see through them, were now sparkling clean. Lydia had even rearranged the furniture, pushing the table closer to the stove and angling the chair toward the light. She was currently standing on a stool, pinning up curtains Clara had made their first year here. "You don't have to do all this," Ethan said. "Yes, I do." She didn't look down, focused on getting the curtain rod level. "If I don't, I'll think too much, and thinking too much is dangerous right now." He understood that, understood it better than she probably realized. "Where will you sleep?" he asked, because he'd just now thought of it. The cabin had 1 bed, 1 room. He'd been so shocked by her arrival that the practicality of the situation hadn't occurred to him. "I noticed a loft." Lydia gestured to the ladder in the corner that led to the small sleeping area under the eaves. Claire had used it for storage mostly, but it had a narrow mattress up there. That will be fine for me. It's cold up there, and cramped. I've slept in worse conditions. She climbed down from the stool and surveyed her work with satisfaction. I spent 2 years at a boarding school with 40 girls sharing one dormitory. Believe me, Mr. Mercer, I can handle a loft. She moved on to the next task without waiting for a response, sorting through Clara's herbs and dried goods, tossing out anything that had spoiled or gone stale. Ethan watched her work, this stranger wearing his dead wife's face, reordering his life without asking permission. He should probably resent it, should tell her to leave him be, that he preferred his squalor and solitude. But as the afternoon light slanted through the clean windows and the cabin began to smell like lye soap and the lavender sachets Lydia had found in Clara's trunk, Ethan realized something that made his chest ache. For the first time in 3 months, the cabin felt like a home again. Not the same home. Clara's absence was still a wound that wouldn't heal, but a home nonetheless, with another human presence, with the sounds of someone living instead of just surviving. "You hungry?" Lydia asked, startling him out of his thoughts. He tried to remember when he'd last eaten. "I could eat." "Good, because I brought real food from town, actual vegetables. When was the last time you had a vegetable, Mr. Mercer?" "I had beans yesterday." "Beans don't count." She was already unpacking provisions from her bags, carrots, potatoes, even a few precious onions. "I'm making stew, and you're going to eat all of it." "Yes, ma'am." The corner of her mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "You can call me Lydia. I think we're past formalities given that we're living together." Living together. The phrase hung in the air, slightly scandalous, though neither of them acknowledged it. What else could they do? She'd come all this way. There was nowhere else for her to stay. And despite the impropriety, despite the strangeness of having this woman, this ghost of his wife, moving through his space, Ethan found he didn't want her to leave. The cabin was too quiet without her. As evening fell and the stew simmered on the stove, filling the cabin with smells he'd almost forgotten existed, Lydia finally sat down at the table. She looked exhausted, her earlier energy flagging. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. She must have been traveling for days, maybe weeks. "How long did it take you to get here?" Ethan asked, ladling stew into bowls. 3 weeks. Train to Denver, then stagecoach to the territorial station. Then I hired the horse for the final leg. She accepted the bowl with a nod of thanks. The stagecoach driver thought I was insane, traveling alone. He tried to convince me to wait for an escort. "Why didn't you?" "Because my sister is dead, Mr. Mercer. Because she died alone on this mountain, with only you here, and I wasn't here to help her." Her voice cracked on the last word, the first sign of emotion breaking through her careful composure. "Because I should have come when she invited me last summer, but I was too busy with my teaching and my comfortable life to spare the time for my own sister." The guilt in her voice was so familiar it hurt. Ethan set down his spoon. "She wasn't alone," he said quietly. "I was with her the whole time. Held her hand, tried everything I knew to bring the fever down. It wasn't enough, but she wasn't alone." Lydia's hands tightened around her bowl. "Did she suffer?" He could lie, make it easier for her, but she'd come all this way for the truth. "Yes," he said, "but not for long. 3 days, and she was—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "Gone." Lydia completed it for him. She closed her eyes, breathing carefully through her nose. When she opened them again, they were still dry. "Thank you for being honest." They ate in silence after that, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. The stew was good, better than anything Ethan had eaten in months. He finished his bowl and was surprised when Lydia immediately refilled it. "You need to eat more," she said. "You're nothing but bones and beard." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. Neither of us is fine." She met his eyes across the table. "But we're going to pretend to be fine, and eventually, maybe we'll actually get there. That's how this works." Ethan had no idea if that was true, but he ate the second bowl of stew anyway, and when Lydia climbed the ladder to the loft with her bedding, he didn't argue about the cold or the cramped quarters. He listened to her moving around up there, arranging her things, settling in. Eventually the sound stopped, and he heard her breathing even out into sleep. Ethan sat by the fire for another hour, watching the flames dance, thinking about the strange turn his life had taken. A month ago, he'd been alone with his grief, half convinced he'd never speak to another soul again. Now there was a woman sleeping in his loft who looked like a ghost and worked like a demon and had crossed a continent to help a man she'd never met. He didn't understand it, but as he finally crawled into bed, sheets clean for the first time in months, lavender scented from Clara's sachets, he had to admit something to himself. He was grateful she'd come, even if he didn't know why, even if her presence was a constant reminder of what he'd lost. The cabin was less empty with her in it. And empty, Ethan had learned, was the worst thing of all. Morning came too early, announced by the sound of someone moving around downstairs. Ethan surfaced from sleep slowly, confused by the noise. For a moment he thought Clara was up making breakfast, and his heart lifted before reality crashed back down. Not Clara. Lydia. He lay there listening to her move through the cabin with quiet efficiency. The clank of the stove being stoked, the splash of water being poured, the soft scrape of the coffee pot. Domestic sounds he hadn't heard in months. When he finally dragged himself out of bed, he found her already dressed, her hair pinned up in a neat bun, sleeves rolled to her elbows as she worked at the stove. "Coffee's ready?" she said without turning around. "And I'm making eggs. The chickens you're apparently not feeding properly actually had some in the coop." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "I've been feeding them. Not enough, clearly. They're half-starved, and the coop needs mucking out. When was the last time you cleaned it?" He couldn't remember. "I'll do it today. We'll do it today, after breakfast." She turned to face him, holding 2 plates of eggs scrambled with wild onions she must have found in Clara's garden patch. "Sit, eat, then we'll make a list of everything that needs doing around here." Ethan wanted to argue that he didn't need her organizing his life, but the eggs smelled too good. He sat and ate in silence while Lydia made her own coffee, standing by the window and looking out at the mountains. "It really is beautiful here," she said quietly. "Clara's letters didn't do it justice." "You read her letters?" "Of course I did. Everyone. I saved them all." Lydia turned from the window, her expression softening. "She wrote about you constantly, how you'd built this cabin with your own hands, how you knew the name of every plant and animal in these mountains, how you'd sit up with her at night reading aloud from whatever book she was obsessed with that week, even though you'd rather be sleeping." Ethan's throat tightened. "She liked her books." "She did. Where are they now? I didn't see them yesterday." "Packed away. In the trunk." Lydia set down her coffee cup with a decisive click. "Get them out." "What?" "Get them out. Books aren't meant to live in trunks." Clara would hate knowing her beloved collection was gathering dust in the dark. She was already moving toward the trunk by the bed, not waiting for permission. "We'll put them on the shelves you built. That's what they're for, isn't it?" She was right, of course. The shelves Ethan had built stood empty against the wall, gathering dust. He'd packed Clara's books away the day after her funeral, unable to stand seeing them, those tangible reminders of all the stories she'd never finish reading. But Lydia was already opening the trunk, pulling out volume after volume with careful hands. Poetry by Whitman and Dickinson. Novels by the Bronte sisters. A worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, natural histories and philosophy, and even a few dime novels Clara had been slightly embarrassed to love. "Help me," Lydia said, and it wasn't really a request. Together, they filled the shelves. Lydia arranged them by author, then stepped back to survey her work with satisfaction. "There. Now it looks like people actually live here, not just exist." The distinction stung because it was accurate. Ethan had been existing for 3 months, nothing more. "All right," Lydia said briskly, pulling a piece of paper from her bag. "Now for that list. The coop needs cleaning. The barn roof looks like it's sagging on the north side. That fence by the creek is falling down. The garden needs to be turned over and prepared for spring planting. "I know what needs doing," Ethan interrupted. "Then why isn't it done?" The question hung in the air between them. Ethan had no good answer, or rather, he had an answer he didn't want to say out loud, Because none of it had mattered when Clara died. Because tending a garden seemed pointless when the person he'd been growing vegetables for was gone. Because fixing fences and repairing roofs felt like admitting he was going to keep living, keep going on, when part of him wanted to lie down in the snow and let the winter take him too. Lydia's expression softened as if she could read his thoughts. "We do it because it needs doing," she said quietly. "We do it because the alternative is giving up. And Clara wouldn't want either of us to give up." She was right, again. Ethan was starting to realize that Lydia being right was going to be a recurring theme. They spent the rest of the morning mucking out the chicken coop. It was disgusting work, the kind that made conversation impossible and thinking difficult, which was probably why Lydia had suggested they start with it. Hard to wallow in grief when you're up to your ankles in chicken shit. Lydia worked without complaint, shoveling manure with the same methodical efficiency she applied to everything else. She'd changed into an older dress and tied a kerchief over her hair, looking more like a farm woman than the refined Eastern lady who'd arrived yesterday. "You've done this before," Ethan observed, watching her work. "I grew up on a small farm outside Philadelphia, before Father made his money and we moved to the city." She dumped another shovelful into the wheelbarrow. "I know my way around a chicken coop, Mr. Mercer." "Ethan," he said. "If we're shoveling shit together, you might as well call me Ethan." That almost smile flickered across her face again. "All right, Ethan." By midday, the coop was clean, fresh straw laid down, and the chickens clucking contentedly as they pecked at the feed Lydia scattered. They moved on to the barn where Ethan showed her the sagging roof. "That's going to need new support beams," Lydia said, tilting her head back to study the damage. "Have you got lumber?" "Some. Might need to cut more." "Then we'll cut more, but not today. Today we patch what we can and move on." She was already climbing the ladder to get a closer look, her skirts bunched up practically around her knees. Ethan looked away, feeling oddly uncomfortable. "You don't have to do all this. You're a guest." "I'm not a guest. Guests leave." Lydia descended the ladder with a piece of rotted beam in her hand. "I'm here for the foreseeable future, which makes me something else entirely. Partner, maybe, or just another set of hands. Either way, I'm working." They worked through the afternoon, patching the worst of the barn roof, feeding the animals, checking the fences. Lydia proved stronger than she looked, capable of hauling water and lifting boards without complaint. But Ethan noticed her hands by evening, blistered and red despite the gloves she wore. "You should stop," he said. "Rest." "I'll rest when we're done." "We're done for today." Lydia looked like she wanted to argue, but her exhaustion won out. She nodded and followed him back to the cabin, where she immediately began preparing dinner. Ethan tried to help, but she shooed him away. "Go wash up. You smell like barn." He did as he was told, scrubbing his face and hands at the basin while Lydia worked at the stove. When he turned back, she was standing very still, staring at something in her hands. Clara's apron, the one she'd worn every day, the one with the embroidered flowers along the hem that she'd stitched herself. "I'm sorry," Lydia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think. I just grabbed it from the hook." Ethan crossed the room and gently took the apron from her trembling hands. "It's all right. You can wear it." She'd want it used, not packed away. Lydia's eyes were wet when she looked up at him. "I miss her so much, and I barely even knew her anymore. We'd only seen each other twice in 5 years, but she was my sister. She was—" Her voice broke. Without thinking, Ethan pulled her into an awkward embrace. She went stiff for a moment, then collapsed against his chest, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He held her, one hand patting her back uselessly, not sure what else to do. "I'm sorry," she gasped against his shirt. "I'm supposed to be helping you, not falling apart." "We can take turns falling apart," Ethan said. "Seems fair." That surprised a laugh out of her, watery but genuine. She pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Look at us. What a pair we make." Two people who loved Clara. That's what we are. Lydia nodded and took a shaky breath. "Yes, that's exactly what we are." She tied the apron around her waist with deliberate care, smoothing down the fabric. "All right, let's finish dinner before we both dissolve into complete hysteria." They ate beans and cornbread, simple food that tasted better than it had any right to because they ate it together instead of alone. Lydia told him about her journey west, The endless rocking of the train, the characters she'd met in the stagecoach, the moment she'd first seen the mountains rising from the plains. I understood then, she said, why Clara loved it here. There's something about the size of everything, the space. It makes you feel small, but in a good way, like your problems aren't as large as you thought. Ethan considered that. I don't know if it makes me feel small, just aware of how much I don't control. Is that different? Maybe not. After dinner, Lydia climbed to the loft while Ethan banked the fire. He heard her moving around up there, settling in, and realized this was going to be his new normal, falling asleep to the sound of someone else breathing, waking to the sounds of another person moving through the space. It should have felt intrusive. Instead, it felt almost right. The days began to blur together into a rhythm of work and routine. They rose early and worked until dark, tackling the endless list of tasks the homestead demanded. Lydia proved herself capable at nearly everything, mending fences, hauling water, even helping Ethan fell trees for lumber when the barn repairs required it. "You swing an axe like you mean it," he commented one afternoon, watching her attack a dead pine. "I do mean it," she replied, not breaking her rhythm. Anger is excellent fuel for manual labor. He understood that too. Some days the work was the only thing keeping him from screaming at the mountains. But it wasn't all grim necessity. Slowly as the days passed and they worked side by side, something else began to emerge. Conversation. Not the careful, grief-laden exchanges of those first days, but actual talk. Lydia told him about her teaching position at a girls' school in Philadelphia, about her students who ranged from eager to impossible. She talked about her literary society, a group of women who met monthly to discuss books, and she admitted with a wry smile to drink wine and complain about men. "What did you complain about?" Ethan asked. "Oh, the usual. Their assumption that we needed their guidance, their shock when we had opinions. One banker spent an entire dinner party explaining economics to me, a subject I'd studied at seminary, as if I were a particularly dim child." Ethan found himself grinning. "What did you do?" Let him finish, then asked him 3 questions he couldn't answer. He avoided me for the rest of the evening. She paused in her fence mending. "Claire used to say I was too sharp for my own good, that I scared men off." "Were you trying to scare them off?" "Usually, yes. Most of them were insufferably boring." She hammered in a nail with more force than strictly necessary. "What about you? How did you end up here?" Ethan leaned against the fence post, watching the clouds drift over the peaks. "Came west after the war. Tried mining for a while, didn't take to it. Worked cattle, worked lumber, finally saved enough to file a homestead claim. This valley seemed right, quiet, room to breathe." "And Clara? How did you meet?" "Town social. She'd come west with a family friend looking for teaching work. Saw her across the room and just..." He trailed off, not sure how to explain it. "Just knew." Lydia nodded slowly. "She wrote about that night. Said you were the shyest man she'd ever met. Barely said 2 words to her. But you asked her to dance." "Only dance I knew was the waltz, and I was terrible at it. She didn't care. She said you looked at her like she was the only person in the room." Lydia's voice had gone soft. "She said it was the most wonderful feeling in the world." They worked in silence after that, both lost in memories of the woman who'd brought them together. As March gave way to April, the snow began its slow retreat, revealing the brown grass and bare earth beneath. The creek swelled with snowmelt, running fast and cold. Lydia declared it was time to start the garden. "It's too early," Ethan argued. "We could still get frost." "Then we plant the hardy things now and the tender things later. But we need to turn the soil, add compost, prepare the beds." She was already surveying the garden plot Clara had established, now overrun with dead weeds from last year. Clara would have had this done weeks ago. That was true. Clara had loved the garden, spent hours planning what to plant where, consulting her seed catalogs like they were sacred texts. They worked the soil together, Ethan turning it with the spade while Lydia broke up clods and pulled weeds. The earth was cold and heavy, reluctant to yield, but gradually they brought it back to life. "What did Clara usually plant?" Lydia asked, brushing dirt from her hands. "Everything. Beans, squash, peas, carrots, potatoes, tomatoes. Though they didn't always ripen at this elevation, herbs for cooking and medicine. He pointed to different sections of the plot. She had it all mapped out, even made a chart. Do you still have the chart? Ethan thought about it. Maybe. In her trunk, probably. They found it that evening, a carefully drawn diagram showing what to plant where, with notes about crop rotation and companion planting. Clara's handwriting covered the margins. Plant marigolds to deter rabbits. Basil near tomatoes. More dill for pickles. Lydia studied it by lamplight, tracing her finger over her sister's words. We'll follow this exactly. We'll grow everything she planned. It felt like a promise, a way of keeping Clara alive through the things she'd cared about. They ordered seeds from the general store in town, a trip that took Ethan most of a day. When he returned, Lydia had cleaned the entire cabin again, rearranged the furniture again, and started a batch of bread that made the whole place smell like civilization. You don't have to clean every time I leave, he said, setting down the seed packets. I do, actually. If I stop moving, I start thinking, and thinking leads to crying, and I'm tired of crying. She punched down the bread dough with unnecessary force. Work is better. Ethan understood that completely. The seeds arrived, and they spent a rainy afternoon sorting them, planning the garden according to Clara's chart. Lydia proved to know more about gardening than he'd expected, explaining about succession planting and soil amendments with the same confidence she applied to everything else. You really did grow up on a farm, Ethan said. Until I was 12, yes. Then Father's shipping business took off, and we moved to the city. Mother wanted us to be ladies. She said the word with gentle mockery. Clara took to it better than I did. She actually enjoyed tea parties and calling cards and all that nonsense. But you didn't. I enjoyed books, ideas, conversation that went deeper than gossip and fashion. Lydia looked up from the seed packets. Clara used to mediate between Mother and me. She understood both of us, could translate between my bluntness and Mother's delicate sensibilities. When she left for Colorado, I lost my interpreter. How did your mother take it? Clara leaving? Lydia's expression darkened. Badly. They had a terrible fight. Mother said Clara was throwing her life away, marrying a man she barely knew and moving to the middle of nowhere. Clara said she'd rather have one real year of life than 50 safe, boring ones. And your father? Died 2 years ago. Heart failure. Lydia's voice was matter-of-fact, but Ethan heard the grief underneath. Mother's living with my aunt in Boston now. I wrote to tell her about Clara, but I haven't heard back. We're not close. The way she said it suggested a story there, but Ethan didn't push. Everyone had complicated family histories. His own parents were long dead, his brother killed in the war. Some losses you learn to carry in silence. They planted the garden over the course of a week, working in the cool spring mornings when the earth was most forgiving. Lydia insisted on doing it properly, spacing the seeds exactly as Clara's chart specified, marking each row with careful labels. If we're going to do this, we're doing it right, she said. No half measures. Ethan found himself agreeing, caught up in her determination. It felt good to have a project, something forward-looking instead of backward grieving. The garden was a promise that summer would come, that life would continue, that there was a future worth planning for. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, Lydia asked the question he'd been waiting for. How long were you two married? 2 years and 3 months. Were they happy years? Ethan thought about how to answer that. Yeah, not easy, always. Building a homestead is hard work, and we didn't have much money, but happy. Clara made everything feel like an adventure, even the hard parts. She was good at that, finding joy in things. Lydia's voice carried a note of envy. I always envied her that. Her lightness. I'm too serious, too practical. She used to tease me about it. Nothing wrong with practical. Maybe not, but it makes for a lonely life. The admission hung in the air between them. Ethan glanced at her profile, illuminated by the dying light. She looked tired, bone-tired, in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. Why did you really come here? He asked. You could have just written a letter, sent your condolences, but you packed up your whole life and rode halfway across the country. Lydia was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because I failed her. When she wrote last summer asking me to visit, I said I was too busy, as if teaching ungrateful girls their grammar was more important than seeing my own sister. She pressed her hands together, hard. I told myself I'd come next year, or the year after. There was always time, I thought, and then there wasn't. So you came now to make up for not coming then? I came now because I had to. Because the thought of you up here alone, grieving in this cabin she loved so much. Lydia turned to look at him directly. Someone needed to make sure you survived. Clara would have wanted that. She would have wanted someone to care whether you ate, whether you washed your clothes, whether you gave up entirely. So here I am. The raw honesty of it left Ethan without words. This woman barely knew him, yet she'd crossed a continent on the strength of her sister's love for him. Thank you, he said finally, for coming, for staying, for... He gestured vaguely at the cabin, the garden, everything. All of it. Lydia nodded. You're welcome. Though I think I'm doing this as much for myself as for you, I needed to be here, to feel close to her somehow. Does that make sense? It did. Perfect sense. They were both here because of Clara, because of the hole she'd left in the world, and somehow her absence had bound them together in ways neither had expected. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Ethan found himself thinking about the future for the first time in months. Not the distant future. He couldn't imagine that far yet. But the immediate future. Summer coming. The garden growing. Lydia staying, at least for a while. It wasn't happiness exactly, but it wasn't the crushing despair he'd lived with all winter either. It was something else. Something newer. A small, tentative sense that maybe life had more chapters left to write. The next morning brought the first real test of their partnership. Ethan woke to find one of the horses foundering, clearly in distress. He rushed to the barn, Lydia right behind him in her nightgown and bare feet. Colic, he said, examining the horse. She needs to walk. For the next 6 hours, they took turns walking the suffering mare in circles around the yard, keeping her moving, stopping her from lying down and potentially twisting her gut. It was exhausting, tense work. The horse fought them, wanted to drop and roll. They fought back, pulling her forward step by painful step. Lydia never complained, never suggested they give up. When Ethan's arms gave out from holding the lead rope, she took over without a word. When she started to stumble from exhaustion, he relieved her. They traded off like that until finally, blessedly, the horse began to improve. By evening, she was eating again. The crisis passed. Ethan and Lydia collapsed on the porch steps, too tired to make it back to the cabin. I thought we were going to lose her, Lydia said, her head tipped back against the railing. Me too. But you did good. Real good. She turned to look at him, and in the fading light, he saw something shift in her expression. We make a decent team, don't we? Yeah, Ethan agreed. We do. It was the truth. They'd settled into a rhythm over the past weeks, learning each other's strengths and weaknesses, figuring out how to work together without getting in each other's way. Lydia was organized where he was haphazard, thorough where he was inclined to cut corners. But he knew the land, knew the animals, knew how to read weather and track game, and all the 100 small skills frontier life demanded. Together, they were stronger than either was alone. As April softened into May, the valley transformed. Wildflowers appeared seemingly overnight, lupine and Indian paintbrush and delicate purple asters. The aspen groves leafed out in that startling spring green that lasted only a few brief weeks. Birds returned, filling the mornings with song. Lydia greeted each change with visible delight. She'd walk through the meadows collecting flowers, pressing them in Clara's books. She'd sit on the porch in the evenings with a cup of tea, just watching the light change on the mountains. I understand now, she said one such evening, why Clara fell in love with this place. There's a wildness to it, a kind of honesty. Things are what they are here. No pretense. Ethan had never thought about it that way, but she was right. The mountains didn't lie, didn't pretend to be anything other than what they were. Beautiful and harsh and utterly indifferent to human concerns. He found himself watching Lydia more and more, curious about this woman who'd invaded his life and made herself indispensable. She was nothing like Clara in personality. Where Clara had been warm and spontaneous, Lydia was reserved and methodical. But there were moments when the resemblance caught him off guard. The way she tilted her head when thinking, the way her hands moved when she talked, the sudden brightness of her rare, genuine smiles. It was both comforting and unsettling. One afternoon, they rode down to the creek together to fish. Ethan showed Lydia how to cast a line, laughing when she got the hook tangled in the trees on her first attempt. "I'm terrible at this," she complained. "You're learning. Here, like this." He stood behind her, guiding her arm through the motion. She was warm against his chest, and he was suddenly, acutely aware of how close they were standing. Lydia must have felt it too, because she went very still. Then she stepped forward, putting distance between them, and tried the cast again. This time the line sailed out perfectly, landing in a quiet pool where trout were feeding. "Better," Ethan said, his voice coming out rougher than intended. They fished in silence after that, the moment passing, but not quite forgotten. That evening, Lydia was quiet through dinner. She picked at her food, staring out the window at the gathering dusk. "You all right?" Ethan finally asked. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, "about how long I'm planning to stay." His stomach dropped. "You're leaving?" "No, not yet. But I can't stay forever, Ethan. I have a life back east. Or I did. I don't know anymore." She set down her fork. "What are we doing here? I came to help you through the worst of it, but you're managing now. The homestead's in order, you're eating properly, taking care of yourself. Maybe it's time I thought about going back." The cabin suddenly felt too small. Ethan stood, paced to the window, tried to organize his thoughts. He didn't want her to leave. The realization hit him with uncomfortable force. Somewhere over the past 2 months, he'd gotten used to her presence. More than used to it. He'd come to rely on it. The sound of her moving around the cabin, the sight of her working in the garden, the way she challenged him, pushed back when he got too withdrawn, made him engage with life instead of just enduring it. "Stay," he heard himself say. "Ethan, stay through the summer at least. The garden needs tending. The barn roof still needs proper repairs. There's 100 things to do, and I could use the help." He turned to face her. "Besides, you said yourself you don't know what's waiting for you back east. Why rush back to uncertainty?" Lydia studied him with those too familiar blue eyes. "Is it just about the work? Or is there another reason you want me to stay?" The question was direct, demanding honesty. Ethan didn't know how to answer it without revealing things he wasn't ready to admit, even to himself. "I don't want to be alone again," he said finally. "That's the truth. These months with you here, they've been easier, better. I'm not ready for that to end. It wasn't everything, but it was enough." Lydia nodded slowly. "All right, through the summer, but then we'll talk about this again." "Fair enough." They finished dinner in more comfortable silence, the tension easing. But that night, lying in bed, Ethan thought about what she'd asked. Was there another reason he wanted her to stay? "Yes," whispered a voice in the back of his mind, but he wasn't ready to examine what that reason might be. Not yet. Summer arrived with the kind of heat that made the high country shimmer. The garden exploded into life, beans climbing their poles, tomatoes swelling on the vine, squash spreading their broad leaves across the carefully tended beds. Lydia worked the garden every morning before the sun grew too fierce, her hands perpetually stained with soil and green from handling plants. Ethan watched her from the barn one morning, struck by how natural she looked there among the rows Clara had planned. She'd abandoned her Eastern dresses weeks ago in favor of simpler skirts and shirts she'd sewn herself from fabric he'd brought from town. Her skin had bronzed from the sun despite the bonnet she wore, and her hands had grown strong and capable. She looked like she belonged here. The thought unsettled him. "You planning to fix that harness or just stare at it all day?" Ethan jerked his attention back to the leather in his hands, not realizing Lydia had noticed him watching. "Just thinking. A dangerous habit." She straightened from the tomato plants, pressing one hand to the small of her back. "I'm riding into town for supplies this afternoon. Need anything?" "You don't have to go. I want to go. I need thread, and Mrs. Henderson mentioned she'd have eggs to trade. Besides, I've been meaning to visit the general store. They're supposed to have new fabric in." Ethan frowned. "You shouldn't ride alone. It's a long way." "I've made the trip twice already without incident. I think I can manage a third time." "That was different. He stopped himself. "I'm what? A woman?" Lydia's eyebrows rose. Ethan Mercer. I crossed half a continent by myself. I think I can handle a 4-hour ride to town and back. She had him there. Still, something about it made him uneasy. At least take the rifle. I always take the rifle. She smiled at his concern. I'll be fine. I'll be back before dark. She was right, of course. She was always right. But Ethan spent the afternoon restless, finding excuses to walk out to the road and scan the horizon, telling himself he was just checking on the weather. When Lydia finally appeared as the sun was lowering, he felt a relief out of proportion to the situation. Told you I'd be fine, she said, dismounting with packages tied to her saddle. Though I did have an interesting conversation in town. Oh? Mrs. Henderson wanted to know when we were getting married. Ethan nearly dropped the bag he was carrying. She what? Apparently the whole town is buzzing with speculation about the widow and his late wife's sister living together unchaperoned. Lydia's tone was light, but her cheeks were flushed. Mrs. Henderson was very delicate about it, of course, said she understood we were both grieving, but that people were starting to talk. Let them talk. Easy for you to say. You're a man. Your reputation isn't at stake. She busied herself untying the packages. Though she did make one fair point. If I'm staying through the summer, we should probably think about appearances. What are you suggesting? I don't know, but we can't just ignore it. This is a small community. We have to live with these people. Lydia carried her packages toward the cabin, not looking at him. Maybe I should think about finding somewhere else to stay. There's that boarding house in town. No. The word came out harder than he'd intended. You're not leaving because of gossip. Then what do you suggest? Ethan had no answer. The problem felt impossible. She couldn't stay without damaging her reputation, but he couldn't imagine her leaving. They'd built something here together over these months, a partnership that went beyond mere necessity. The cabin felt right with her in it. His life felt right with her in it. But what did that mean? They avoided the topic for the next few days, both of them stepping carefully around the question Mrs. Henderson had raised. But the awareness was there now, impossible to ignore. Every shared meal felt weighted. Every evening on the porch took on new significance. The easy rhythm they'd found was disrupted by the sudden consciousness of what they were. A man and a woman, unrelated, unmarried, living together in a way that would have been scandalous anywhere but on the frontier, where necessity often trumped propriety. The tension finally broke at the town social. It was the first Saturday in June, and half the valley turned out for the monthly gathering at the community hall. Lydia had been excited about it all week, eager to meet more of the neighbors and see what passed for society out here. She'd made a new dress for the occasion, pale blue cotton with white trim, and she looked beautiful in a way that made Ethan's chest tight. They rode in together, arriving as the sun was setting and lanterns were being lit inside the hall. Music drifted out, a fiddle and banjo playing something lively. People milled around outside, talking and laughing, children running between the adults' legs. Ethan helped Lydia down from her horse and immediately felt the eyes on them. Conversations paused. Women's heads drew together in whispered consultation. He saw Mrs. Henderson nudge her husband and nod in their direction. Ignore them, he muttered to Lydia. Hard to ignore that. She kept her chin up, but he could see the tension in her shoulders as they walked toward the hall. Inside was better. The music was loud enough to discourage gossip, and people were focused on dancing and eating from the long tables laden with food. Tom Garrett caught sight of them and waved them over. Mercer and Miss Hale, good to see you. Tom's smile was genuine, without any of the speculation Ethan had seen on other faces. You folks eating yet? My wife made her famous berry pie. They filled plates and found seats at one of the long tables. Other neighbors drifted over, some genuinely friendly, others clearly fishing for information about their living arrangements. Lydia handled it all with polite deflection, neither confirming nor denying the implications in their questions. When the dancing started, several men approached Lydia asking for a dance. She accepted graciously, and Ethan watched her whirl around the floor with a succession of partners. She was a good dancer, light on her feet, laughing at something one of the younger cowboys said. Something dark and ugly twisted in Ethan's gut. He recognized it finally. Jealousy. He was jealous of these men dancing with Lydia, holding her waist, making her smile. The realization should have horrified him. This was Clara's sister. He had no right to feel possessive of her. But there it was anyway, burning in his chest like hot coal. You planning to ask her to dance or just glower at everyone who does? Ethan turned to find Tom's wife, Sarah, standing behind him with a knowing smile. I don't dance much anymore. You danced with Clara at every social. Sarah's expression softened. I know you're grieving, Ethan. We all know that. But that girl in there didn't come all this way to watch you suffer from a distance. Ask her to dance. People will talk. People are already talking. Give them something worth talking about. Sarah moved away before he could respond, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts and the jealousy still burning in his chest. He watched Lydia finish a reel with one of the Harrison boys, watched her politely decline the next dance and move toward the refreshment table instead. Before he could talk himself out of it, Ethan crossed the room. Dance with me. Lydia turned, surprise clear on her flushed face. You don't have to. I want to. He held out his hand. If you're not too tired. She studied his face for a long moment, and he wondered what she saw there. Then she placed her hand in his. All right. The music had shifted to something slower, a waltz. Ethan led her onto the floor and pulled her into the proper position, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers. They began to move, and suddenly he was back at that first social where he'd met Clara, terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. But this wasn't Clara in his arms. This was Lydia, and she moved differently, held herself differently. Where Clara had been soft and yielding, Lydia was firm and sure. She met his eyes instead of looking away shyly. She didn't need him to lead. They moved together as equals. You're better at this than you claimed, Lydia said. You told Clara you could barely dance. I learned. She made me practice. The memory should have hurt, but somehow it didn't. Not right now. With Lydia warm in his arms and the music swelling around them. She said if I was going to be her husband, I had to be able to dance with her properly. Sounds like her. Always improving people whether they wanted it or not. Lydia's smile was fond. She tried to improve me for years, never quite succeeded. Maybe you didn't need improving. The words came out more intense than he'd intended. Lydia's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment they just stared at each other while their feet kept moving. Then someone jostled them from behind, breaking the spell. They finished the dance in silence, both suddenly aware of how close they were standing, how many eyes were watching them. When the music ended, Lydia stepped back quickly. Thank you for the dance. Lydia, I need some air. Excuse me. She fled toward the door before he could stop her. Ethan stood there feeling foolish and confused, not sure what had just happened, but knowing something had shifted between them. He found her outside a few minutes later, standing in the shadows beyond the lantern light, her arms wrapped around herself despite the warm night. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. You didn't. That's the problem. Lydia turned to face him, and in the dim light her eyes were huge and dark. We need to talk about this, Ethan, about what's happening here. What do you think is happening? I think we're both lonely. I think we've grown comfortable with each other out of necessity and proximity, and I think it would be very easy to confuse that comfort for something else. The clinical way she said it should have brought relief. Instead, it felt like a door closing. Is that all it is to you? Comfort and proximity? Lydia looked away. I don't know. I don't trust myself to know. I came here to grieve my sister, to help you honor her memory. Not to... She broke off, shaking her head. This isn't right. None of this is right. Why not? Because she's been dead less than 6 months. Because I look exactly like her. And I don't know if you see me or just a replacement for what you lost. Her voice rose, cracking with emotion. Because I'm terrified that I'm going to fall in love with you for all the wrong reasons, and it will ruin everything. The confession hung in the air between them. Ethan's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. You think I see you as a replacement? He asked quietly. Don't you? How could you not? We have the same face, the same... You're nothing like Clara. The words came out harsh, and Lydia flinched. Ethan forced himself to continue more gently. You look like her, yes, but you're not her. Clara was spontaneous and warm and saw the best in everyone. You're careful and practical and see the world exactly as it is. She loved without thinking. You think before you love. You're two completely different people, Lydia. I know that. I've always known that. Then why? Her voice was barely a whisper. Why do you look at me the way you do? Because you're you. Because you crossed a continent to help a stranger. Because you work harder than anyone I've ever met. Because you make me want to fix the barn roof properly instead of just patching it. Because when you laugh, which isn't often enough, it sounds like music. He took a step closer. Because I'm falling for you, Lydia. Not for your sister's ghost. For you. Lydia pressed her hands to her face. This is too fast. It's too soon. People will think, I don't care what people think. Well, I do. I care that they'll say I came here to trap you, to take my sister's place before she's cold in the ground. I care that they'll never see me as anything but Clara's replacement. She dropped her hands, and her eyes were wet with unshed tears. I care that I don't know if any of this is real or just two grieving people clinging to each other because we're both drowning. The anguish in her voice cut him. Ethan wanted to pull her into his arms, to promise her everything would be all right, but he could see that wasn't what she needed right now. What do you want to do? He asked instead. I think I should leave. Go back east like I planned. Give us both space to figure out what we're actually feeling. Every instinct in him screamed against it, but Ethan forced himself to nod. If that's what you need. It's not what I need, it's what's right. Lydia wiped her eyes roughly. I'll leave after the harvest. That gives us the summer to think about this properly, to be sure. And if we're still sure after the summer, then we'll talk about it, really talk about it. She took a shaky breath. But Ethan, you need to promise me something. Promise me you'll think about whether you're ready for this, whether you're truly over Clara or whether I'm just a convenient way to avoid dealing with her loss. The request stung, but it was fair. I promise. They stood there in the darkness, neither quite willing to move first, both knowing the conversation was over but not wanting to let go of the moment. Finally, Lydia straightened her shoulders. We should go back inside. People will talk if we're out here too long together. Let them talk. No. She managed a small smile. Let's not give them more ammunition than they already have. They walked back to the hall together, maintaining a careful distance. For the rest of the evening, they stayed on opposite sides of the room, speaking to other people, avoiding each other's eyes. But Ethan felt Lydia's presence like a magnetic pull, always aware of where she was, who she was talking to, whether she was smiling or looked uncomfortable. The ride home was silent. They sat side by side on the wagon bench, both lost in their own thoughts, the horse plodding along the familiar trail in the moonlight. When they reached the cabin, Lydia climbed down without waiting for help and disappeared inside without a word. Ethan saw to the horse, taking longer than necessary, giving her time to retreat to the loft. But when he finally entered the cabin, she was still downstairs, standing by the window with her arms wrapped around herself. I'm sorry, she said without turning around. I shouldn't have said those things. It wasn't fair to you. You said what needed saying. Ethan hung his hat on the peg by the door. And you're right. We need to be sure about this, both of us. Are you angry? No. Confused, maybe. But not angry. Lydia finally turned to face him. In the lamplight, her face looked younger, more vulnerable. I don't want to hurt you, Ethan, or dishonor Clara's memory, or make a terrible mistake because I'm lonely and scared and so far from everything I've ever known. Then we'll take it slow. We'll think about it like you said. And if you decide you need to leave, I'll understand. Will you? Ethan considered lying, but she deserved honesty. No, but I'll accept it. There's a difference. That surprised a sad laugh out of her. You're a good man, Ethan Mercer. Claire was right about that. She climbed to the loft then, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts and the lingering scent of her lavender soap. The next few weeks were strange. They continued their routine, working the garden, tending the animals, managing the homestead. But there was a new awareness between them. Every casual touch felt loaded. Every shared glance carried weight. They were careful with each other, polite to the point of awkwardness. Ethan thought constantly about what Lydia had asked. Was he really over Clara? Or was he using Lydia to avoid his grief? He visited Clara's grave more often, standing there trying to sort through his tangled feelings. He still missed his wife. The missing wasn't as sharp as it had been, But it was there. A permanent ache in his chest. He missed her laugh, her optimism, the way she'd made even hard days feel manageable. But when he thought about the future, when he imagined the homestead a year from now or 5 years from now, it was Lydia he saw there. Lydia working in the garden, Lydia sitting by the fire with a book, Lydia arguing with him about the proper way to stack firewood or organize the pantry. Was that wrong? Was he betraying Clara's memory by falling for her sister? "What do I do?" he asked the silent grave. "Tell me what to do." But Clara, of course, didn't answer. The dead never did. It was Tom Garrett who finally gave Ethan something approaching clarity. Tom stopped by one afternoon with fresh game, a brace of rabbits he'd caught, and found Ethan repairing the corral fence with more violence than the task required. "Easy there. You're trying to fix the fence, not murder it." Tom handed over the rabbits and leaned against the post. "Want to tell me what's eating you?" "Nothing, just working." "Right, and I'm the Queen of England." Tom pulled out his tobacco pouch and started rolling a cigarette. "This about Miss Hale?" Ethan's silence was answer enough. "Thought so. Whole town's been watching you two dance around each other." Tom lit the cigarette and took a long drag. "You know what your problem is, Mercer? You're thinking too much." Lydia said the same thing. "Smart woman. Look, I know you love Clara. We all knew it, but she's gone, and you're not. Neither is Miss Hale. And from where I'm standing, you two are good for each other. People think it's too soon, that I'm dishonoring Clara's memory. People think all kinds of stupid things. Doesn't make them true." Tom flicked ash into the dirt. "You want to know what I think? I think Clara would want you to be happy. I think she'd look at her sister, who came all this way to take care of you, and think it was perfect." "You didn't know Clara that well." "No, but I knew her well enough to know she wasn't the kind of woman who'd want you suffering forever out of some misguided loyalty." Tom stubbed out the cigarette. "Life's too short and too hard out here to waste chances at happiness. If you've got feelings for Miss Hale and she's got feelings for you, it seems foolish to ignore that just because of what people might say." After Tom left, Ethan stood in the corral for a long time, thinking about what he'd said. The man had a point. Life on the frontier was brutal and unpredictable. You took happiness where you could find it because there was no guarantee of tomorrow, but knowing that intellectually and feeling it emotionally were two different things. That evening, a summer storm rolled in from the west. Ethan and Lydia watched it approach from the porch, drawn by the spectacular display of lightning illuminating the clouds. The air smelled of ozone and rain. "We should go inside," Lydia said as the first drops began to fall. "It's going to pour." But neither of them moved. There was something mesmerizing about the storm, the way the lightning split the sky, the distant rumble of thunder rolling across the valley. Then the sky opened up. Rain came down in sheets, soaking them in seconds. Lydia laughed, actually laughed, and held her face up to the downpour. Ethan stared at her, this woman who'd been so controlled and careful these past weeks, suddenly abandoning herself to the storm. "It's wonderful," she shouted over the rain. "I haven't been caught in a storm like this since I was a child." She looked radiant, alive, more beautiful than he'd ever seen her. Ethan crossed the porch in 2 steps and kissed her. For a moment, Lydia went rigid with surprise. Then she softened, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, pulling him closer. The kiss was desperate and tender and tasted like rain and electricity and all the things they'd been holding back for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lydia's eyes were huge. That was, "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have, don't you dare apologize." She was still gripping his shirt. "But Ethan, we said we'd wait. We said we'd think about this." "I've thought about nothing else for weeks." He cupped her face in his hands. "I'm sure, Lydia. I'm sure about you. About us. About wanting you to stay not just through the summer, but forever. Forever is a long time. Not long enough." Lydia closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "I'm terrified." "Me too. What if we're making a terrible mistake? What if the town never accepts us? What if we're just using each other to avoid dealing with our grief? Then we'll deal with it together." Ethan tilted her face up so she had to look at him. "I can't promise it'll be easy. I can't promise people won't talk or judge. But I can promise you this. I see you, Lydia Hale. Not Clara's sister, not a replacement, you. And I want you to stay. A tear slipped down her cheek, mixing with the rain. Ask me properly. What? If you want me to stay forever, ask me properly. Ethan's heart was pounding so hard he could barely breathe. He dropped to one knee right there on the wet porch, rain streaming down his face, still holding her hand. Lydia Hale, will you marry me? Will you stay here and build a life with me and argue with me about everything and make this cabin a home again? Lydia was crying openly now, her face a mix of joy and fear and something that looked like hope. I don't have an answer yet. I need to think. I need to... She pulled him to his feet and kissed him again, harder this time, pouring everything she couldn't say into the gesture. When they finally came up for air, both soaked to the skin and shivering, Lydia pressed her forehead to his. Give me until tomorrow, she whispered. Let me think clearly, without rain and lightning and you looking at me like that. If I'm going to say yes to this, I need to be sure it's for the right reasons. It wasn't the answer Ethan wanted, but he understood. Tomorrow, then. They went inside and changed into dry clothes in awkward silence. Lydia climbed to the loft without another word, leaving Ethan alone by the dying fire. He didn't sleep that night, just lay there listening to the rain and wondering if he'd just made the best or worst decision of his life. Morning came too slowly and too fast at the same time. Ethan was up before dawn, unable to lie still any longer. He moved through his chores mechanically, feeding the animals, hauling water, his mind replaying the kiss on the porch over and over. The way Lydia had felt in his arms, the desperation and rightness of it, the fear in her eyes when she'd asked for time to think. He was mucking out the barn when he heard the cabin door open. His whole body tensed, but he forced himself to keep working, giving her space to come to him in her own time. She didn't come to the barn. Instead, when he looked up an hour later, he saw her walking toward the clearing where Clara was buried. She carried something in her hands. Flowers from the garden, he realized. The same wildflowers Clara had loved. Ethan's chest tightened. Of course she'd go there. Of course she'd seek Clara's counsel, even though Clara couldn't answer. Maybe especially because Clara couldn't answer. He wanted to follow her, to hear what she said, to know what she was thinking. But this was between Lydia and her sister. Some conversations weren't meant to be overheard. So he went back to work and tried not to watch the minutes crawl by. Lydia knelt in the grass beside her sister's grave, the morning sun warm on her back. She'd been there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The flowers lay in her lap, forgotten for the moment. I don't know what to do, she said aloud, her voice startling in the quiet. I don't know if what I'm feeling is real or just loneliness wearing love's face. Help me, Clara. Tell me what to do. The grave, of course, offered no response. Just the wooden cross and the wildflowers she'd brought on her first day here, now dried and brown. Lydia traced the carved letters of her sister's name with one finger. You loved him so much. Your letters were full of him. Ethan this, Ethan that. How he built you shelves without being asked. How he'd read to you even though he'd rather be sleeping. How he looked at you like you were the only thing in the world worth seeing. She paused, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. And now he's looking at me that way. And I don't know if it's because he sees me or if it's because I remind him of you. I don't know if I'm Lydia to him or just a shadow of what he lost. The wind picked up, rustling through the aspen leaves. Lydia closed her eyes and listened to it, trying to find some kind of answer in the sound. I think I love him, she whispered. I didn't mean to. I came here to help, to honor you, to make sure he survived. But somewhere along the way, between the garden and the barn repairs and the 1,000 small moments of just being together, I fell in love with him, with his quietness and his strength and the way he sees right through my defenses. She opened her eyes and stared at the grave. But is that enough? Is love enough when the whole town will whisper that I trapped him, that I came here to take your place? That I'm dishonoring your memory by marrying your husband before you're even a year in the ground? Lydia had spent the entire night wrestling with these questions. She'd lain in the loft, listening to Ethan moving restlessly downstairs and tried to think clearly, tried to separate what she felt from what she should feel, what she wanted from what was proper. But clarity hadn't come. Just more confusion, more doubt, more fear. What would you want me to do? Lydia asked the silent grave. If you could speak, what would you tell me? Would you be angry that I'm falling for your husband? Or would you want him to be happy, even if that happiness comes from me? She thought about Clara, really thought about her, not as the perfect sister she'd idealized since the funeral, but as the real complicated person she'd been. Clara, who'd driven their mother mad with her impulsiveness. Clara, who'd married a man she barely knew and moved to the wilderness on nothing but faith and love. Clara, who'd always pushed Lydia to take chances, to stop being so careful, to live instead of just thinking about living. "You'd tell me to stop overthinking it, wouldn't you?" Lydia said, and despite everything, she smiled. "You'd say I was being too practical, too cautious. You'd tell me that love doesn't wait for the proper amount of time to pass or for society's approval. You'd tell me to grab happiness with both hands while I had the chance." The certainty of it settled over her like a blanket. Clara would want this. Clara, who'd loved Ethan and who'd loved Lydia, would want them to find comfort and happiness together. She wouldn't begrudge them love just because it came sooner than expected or in a way that might scandalize the neighbors. But knowing what Clara would want and knowing what she herself should do were still two different things. Lydia placed the fresh flowers on the grave, arranging them carefully around the base of the cross. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared of making a mistake. Scared of being judged. Scared that I'm not enough, that I'll always be compared to you and found wanting. But I'm more scared of walking away from something real just because it's complicated." She stood, brushing dirt from her skirt, and took a long look at the valley spread out below. This was what Clara had seen from this spot. This was why she'd wanted to rest here. The view was breathtaking, mountains rising in every direction, the creek winding through the valley floor, the cabin and barn looking small and sturdy against the immensity of the landscape. "I'm going to say yes," Lydia said to the grave, to the valley, to the sister who couldn't hear her. "I'm going to marry him. Not to replace you, no one could replace you. But because I love him in my own way and because I think we could be happy together, because life is too short and too uncertain to waste chances at happiness." She paused, waiting for some sign that she was making the right choice, but the valley just sat there in its morning beauty, offering no judgment, no approval, just existence. That was enough. Lydia turned and walked back toward the cabin, her decision made. She found Ethan in the barn, pitchfork in hand, watching her approach with an expression so hopeful and terrified it made her heart ache. "I need to say something first," she said before he could speak, "before I give you my answer." Ethan set down the pitchfork and waited. "I'm not Clara. I know I look like her. I know I remind you of her. But I'm not her and I never will be. I'm more difficult than she was, more stubborn, less warm. I'll argue with you and challenge you and probably drive you half mad with my need to organize everything. I know all that. And I need you to promise me that you know the difference, that when you look at me, you see me. Lydia. Not Clara's shadow or her replacement or some combination of the two. Just me." Ethan crossed the barn to stand directly in front of her. He cupped her face in his hands, his calloused thumbs gentle against her cheeks. "I see you, Lydia Hale. I've seen you from the day you arrived, even when I was too grief-blind to admit it. I see your strength and your stubbornness and your terrible habit of reorganizing my tools when you think I'm not looking. I see the way you attack work like it's a personal enemy. I see how you press flowers in books and sing under your breath when you think no one's listening. I see you, only you." Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "You hear me singing? Every morning in the garden. You're terrible at it, by the way." She laughed, a watery sound that came out half sob. "I know, Clara used to tell me I sounded like a dying cat. She was right, but I love it anyway." Ethan smiled, and it transformed his whole face. "So what's your answer?" "Yes." The word came out quiet but sure. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll stay. Yes to all of it." Ethan pulled her into his arms and kissed her, slower and sweeter than last night's desperate kiss in the rain. This kiss was a promise, a beginning, a choice they were both making with clear eyes and open hearts. When they finally pulled apart, Lydia was breathless and grinning. "So what now?" "Now we figure out how to tell the town without causing a riot." "Maybe we should elope. Ride to Denver, get married quietly, come back and present it as a fait accompli." Ethan considered it. Tempting. But I think we need to face this head on. Show everyone we're not ashamed or sneaking around. This is real and right, and we're not going to hide it. Even though they'll judge us? Let them judge. We know the truth. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Besides, Tom says the town's been placing bets on when we'd finally admit we had feelings for each other. Apparently half of them saw this coming from the start. Tom Garrett has a big mouth. He does. But he's also usually right. They spent the rest of the morning planning. They'd go to town together, speak to the minister about performing the ceremony, and make it clear to anyone who asked that this wasn't some scandalous affair, but a genuine choice made by two people who'd found each other through grief. When should we do it? Lydia asked as they worked together in the garden that afternoon, the normalcy of the task grounding after the emotional upheaval of the morning. Sooner rather than later. I don't want to give people time to talk us out of it or for us to second-guess ourselves. Ethan pulled a weed and tossed it aside. After the harvest? That gives us a few weeks to prepare, to make sure you're absolutely certain. I'm certain now. I know. But let's do this right. Give yourself time to settle into the decision, and it'll give the town time to get used to the idea before the ceremony. Lydia nodded, seeing the wisdom in it, even though part of her wanted to rush to the minister today and be done with it. After the harvest, then. That's, late August? Early September, most likely. All right, September. She sat back on her heels, looking at the thriving garden around them. Clara would love seeing how well everything's grown. She would. Ethan reached over and took Lydia's hand, dirt and all. Thank you for keeping her garden alive. It's my garden now, too. Ours. Lydia squeezed his hand. Everything here is ours now. That's what marriage means, isn't it? Sharing everything? Everything, Ethan agreed. The good and the difficult, and all the ordinary moments in between. They told Mrs. Henderson first, figuring the news would spread faster if she was the source. They rode to her homestead the next day and found her hanging laundry, her weathered face lighting up when she saw them approach together. Well now, she said, setting down her laundry basket, this looks official. Mrs. Henderson, Ethan began, suddenly awkward. We wanted you to hear it from us first. Lydia and I are getting married, after the harvest. Mrs. Henderson looked between them, her expression unreadable. Lydia held her breath, prepared for judgment or disapproval or shocked scandal. Instead, the older woman broke into a wide smile. About damn time. I was beginning to think you two were the most stubborn people in the territory. She pulled Lydia into a fierce hug. I'm happy for you, dear, truly happy. And don't you worry about the gossips. Anyone with eyes could see this was coming, and anyone with a heart knows Clara would approve. You think so? Lydia asked, surprising herself with how much she needed the reassurance. I know so. I knew your sister, maybe not well, but enough to know she'd want the people she loved to be happy, and she loved both of you. Mrs. Henderson held Lydia at arm's length, studying her face. You're good for him. You've brought him back to life. That's not nothing. The acceptance so freely given nearly undid Lydia. She blinked back tears and managed a smile. Thank you. Now, when's this wedding happening? And do you need help with anything? A dress? Food? I make a mean wedding cake. They left Mrs. Henderson's place an hour later, loaded down with promises of help and well wishes. As predicted, the news spread through the valley like wildfire. By the end of the week, everyone within 20 miles knew that Ethan Mercer was marrying his late wife's sister. The reactions were mixed. Some neighbors stopped by with congratulations and offers of assistance. Sarah Garrett immediately enlisted Lydia's help in planning the ceremony, treating it like the social event of the season. Several of the valley women offered fabric for a wedding dress, recipes for the celebration feast, and advice both solicited and not. But there were disapproving voices too. Old Mrs. Pemberton from the boarding house made pointed comments about propriety and decent mourning periods. The minister, while willing to perform the ceremony, made it clear he had reservations about the timing. A few of the more conservative families made their disapproval known through conspicuous silence, neither condemning nor congratulating. Lydia felt each judgment like a small cut, but Ethan was unmoved. Their opinions don't matter, he told her one evening as she fretted over a particularly cutting remark someone had made in town. What matters is us, what we know to be true. Easy for you to say. You're not the woman being called an opportunist. Ugh, they're calling me worse things, saying I'm dishonoring Clara's memory, that I never really loved her if I could move on so fast. Ethan pulled Lydia close. But I did love her. I still love her memory, and I love you. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. How do you make it sound so simple? Because it is simple. The complications are all external, other people's judgments and expectations. But what we feel, what we've chosen, that's simple. We love each other. We want to build a life together. Everything else is just noise. Lydia wished she could see it that way. But the disapproval gnawed at her, made her second-guess herself in quiet moments. Was she being selfish? Rushing into something she wasn't ready for? Using Ethan to avoid returning to a life in Philadelphia that had started to feel empty and meaningless? She took her doubts back to Clara's grave one afternoon, needing the connection to her sister even though she knew no answers would come. They're saying terrible things, she told the wooden cross. They're saying I planned this from the beginning, that I came here to steal your husband, that I'm a vulture picking over your remains. She pressed her hands to her face. Maybe they're right. Maybe I am terrible for doing this. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. She'd come here out of grief and duty. Love had been a surprise, not a scheme, and the happiness she'd found with Ethan felt too real, too hard-won to be dismissed as opportunism. I wish you could tell me it's all right, Lydia whispered. I wish you could give me permission, but you can't, and I have to make this choice without your blessing. I have to trust that what I feel is real and that you'd understand even if no one else does. The harvest came in strong that year. The garden produced more than Lydia and Ethan could possibly eat, squash and beans and tomatoes and herbs in abundance. They spent long days preserving everything, filling the root cellar with stores for the winter. It was hot, exhausting work, but satisfying in a bone-deep way. This is what Clara wanted, Lydia said one evening, surveying the neat rows of preserves lining the shelves. She wrote about wanting to be self-sufficient, to grow enough to see you through the winter without needing to rely on the general store. We did it. You did it. Ethan wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. She'd be proud. Do you really think so? I know so. As September approached, the reality of the wedding became impossible to ignore. Lydia worked on her dress in the evenings, altering one of Clara's nicer gowns to fit her. It felt strange at first, wearing her dead sister's clothes to marry her husband, but Sarah Garrett assured her it was fitting. You're honoring her by using it, Sarah said, helping with the alterations. You're including her in the ceremony even though she can't be there. That's beautiful, not morbid. Lydia wanted to believe her. She tried on the finished dress one evening when Ethan was out checking the fence lines. It fit perfectly, the pale ivory fabric complementing her sun-bronzed skin. She looked at herself in the small mirror and saw not Clara staring back, but herself. Lydia Hale, about to become Lydia Mercer. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt right. The night before the wedding, Lydia couldn't sleep. She climbed down from the loft to find Ethan sitting by the fire, clearly as restless as she was. Can't sleep either? She asked. Too much thinking. He made room for her on the bench beside him. You having second thoughts? Third and fourth thoughts. But not about you, about everything else, about whether we're doing the right thing, the right way. What would the right way look like? Lydia considered it. I don't know. Maybe there isn't a right way. Maybe there's just our way, and we have to trust that it's enough. Our way, Ethan repeated. I like that. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to embers. After a while, Ethan spoke again. I want to tell you something about Clara. Lydia tensed slightly but nodded for him to continue. The night she died, she was delirious with fever, barely conscious, but she kept saying your name over and over. Lydia, right to Lydia. Ethan stared into the fire. I thought she just wanted you to know she'd died, but now I think maybe she wanted something else. Maybe she knew somehow that you'd come, that you and I would... He broke off, shaking his head. Maybe I'm imagining things? Or maybe she knew us both well enough to see what we couldn't, Lydia said softly. She knew you'd need help. She knew I'd come. Maybe she even knew we'd find each other in our grief. You think she'd planned it? No, but I think maybe she hoped for it. In some part of herself, she hoped that if she was gone, the two people she loved most wouldn't be alone. Lydia took Ethan's hand. That sounds like Clara, even dying, thinking about everyone else. They sat there until the fire died completely, holding hands in the darkness, drawing comfort from each other's presence. When Lydia finally climbed back to the loft, she felt more at peace than she had in weeks. Tomorrow she would marry Ethan Mercer. Tomorrow she would bind her life to his in front of the community that had judged them and the few who'd supported them. Tomorrow she would step fully into this new life she'd chosen. But tonight, she was still Lydia Hale, still separate, still her own person. And that was all right. Marriage wouldn't erase who she was. It would just add something new to it. She fell asleep thinking about Clara, about Ethan, about the strange and winding path that had brought her to this moment. And for the first time since her sister's death, Lydia felt something that had been missing for months. She felt hope. Morning broke clear and bright, the kind of perfect September day that seemed designed for new beginnings. Lydia woke in the loft to golden sunlight streaming through the small window and the sound of Ethan already moving around downstairs. Her wedding day. The thought made her stomach flip with a mixture of excitement and nerves. She dressed carefully in her everyday clothes, saving the altered gown for later. When she climbed down the ladder, she found Ethan at the stove making coffee, his hair damp from washing, already dressed in his good shirt. "Morning," he said, and the smile he gave her was so open and genuine it made her heart skip. "You sleep all right?" "Better than I expected." She accepted the coffee he offered. "You?" "Like a stone. First good sleep I've had in days." He leaned against the counter, studying her face. "You ready for this?" "I think so. Ask me again in a few hours." They ate breakfast together in companionable silence, neither quite sure what to say. The ceremony was set for 2 o'clock at the homestead. Lydia had insisted on having it here rather than in town, wanting Clara's presence to be felt, even if only symbolically. Sarah Garrett and several of the neighbor women were arriving early to help set up, and the minister would come with them. "I should start getting ready," Lydia said, though it was barely 9. "The ladies will be here soon, and Sarah will have my head if I'm not prepared." Ethan caught her hand as she moved past him. "Lydia, thank you." "For what?" "For saying yes. For staying. For giving us a chance." He pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "For being exactly who you are." Lydia kissed him softly. "Thank you for seeing who I am, for not expecting me to be someone else." The moment was broken by the sound of wagons approaching. Sarah and 3 other women descended on the cabin like a benevolent whirlwind, shooing Ethan out to the barn and taking over the space with feminine efficiency. "Out, out," Sarah commanded. "You don't get to see the bride until the ceremony. It's bad luck." "That's for the wedding day," Ethan protested. "It's already the wedding day." "Then it's especially bad luck. Go find Tom and the others. They should be here soon to help set up chairs." Ethan went, grinning at Lydia over his shoulder as the women closed ranks around her. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. The women transformed the cabin and the clearing outside into something resembling a proper venue for a wedding. Wildflowers appeared in mason jars. Chairs were arranged in neat rows facing the spot where Ethan and Lydia would stand, and food began appearing on every available surface as neighbors arrived with contributions to the celebration feast. In the cabin, Sarah helped Lydia into the altered dress, while Mrs. Henderson pinned up her hair in an elaborate style that would have made her Philadelphia society friends proud. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, stepping back to admire her work. "Absolutely beautiful." Lydia studied herself in the small mirror. The woman looking back was neither Clara nor the Eastern lady who'd arrived on this homestead 7 months ago. She was someone new, someone who'd been forged by grief and hard work and unexpected love. Her hands were calloused, her skin bronzed by the sun, but her eyes were bright with hope. "I wish she could see this," Lydia said softly, touching the lace at her collar, lace Clara had sewn herself. "I wish I knew for certain she'd approve." Sarah squeezed her shoulder. "She approves. I'd stake my life on it. Clara loved you both too much not to want you to be happy." Outside, more people were arriving. Lydia heard the murmur of voices, the sound of Tom Garrett's booming laugh, children running and playing. The community was gathering, those who supported them and those who'd come out of curiosity or judgment. Either way, they were here. It's almost time, Sarah said, glancing out the window. The minister's here and Ethan's ready. Are you ready? Lydia took a deep breath. Yes, I'm ready. She walked outside into the September sunshine, and the gathered crowd turned to look at her. There were perhaps 30 people, not a large gathering by city standards, but significant for this remote valley. Lydia saw friendly faces and critical ones, curiosity and approval and disapproval all mixed together. But then she saw Ethan, standing beneath an arch Tom and the others had constructed and decorated with aspen branches and late-blooming flowers. He was clean-shaven, his hair neatly trimmed, wearing his best clothes. But it was his expression that undid her, the wonder and love and barely suppressed joy written plainly on his face as he watched her approach. For him, she could face any judgment. For them, she could be brave. Sarah walked beside her, standing in his family since Lydia had none here. They moved slowly through the rows of chairs, Lydia keeping her eyes on Ethan, using him as her anchor against the sea of watching faces. When they reached the arch, Sarah squeezed Lydia's hand once and stepped aside. Lydia took her place next to Ethan, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him, to see that his hands were shaking slightly with nerves. "You look beautiful," he whispered. "You clean up pretty well yourself." The minister cleared his throat and the murmuring crowd fell silent. He was an older man, weathered by years on the frontier, and while he'd expressed reservations about the timing of this wedding, his expression now was kind. "We are gathered here today," he began, his voice carrying across the clearing, "to witness the union of Ethan Mercer and Lydia Hale. Marriage is a sacred covenant, not to be entered into lightly, but with reverence and commitment." Lydia barely heard the traditional words. She was too focused on Ethan's hand holding hers, on the steady way he met her eyes, on the rightness of this moment despite all the complications that had brought them here. If anyone knows of any reason why these two should not be joined in matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace. The silence that followed felt endless. Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment someone could object, could voice all the whispered criticisms and judgment that had followed their announcement, but no one spoke. The silence held, sacred and complete. The minister nodded, satisfied. "Ethan Mercer, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health? Until death do you part?" "I do." Ethan's voice was strong and clear, no hesitation. "And do you, Lydia Hale, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Lydia looked at Ethan, this man who'd lost everything and found the strength to love again, this man who saw her for exactly who she was, this man who'd become her partner and her home. "I do." Tom stepped forward with the rings, simple gold bands they'd purchased in town. Ethan's hands were steady now as he slid the ring onto Lydia's finger, repeating the words the minister prompted. Then it was her turn, and she slid the matching band onto Ethan's calloused hand, feeling the significance of the gesture settle deep in her bones. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The minister smiled. "You may kiss your bride." Ethan cupped Lydia's face in his hands and kissed her softly, sweetly, a promise and a beginning all at once. The gathered crowd erupted in applause and cheers, the sound washing over them like a wave. When they pulled apart, both grinning, Lydia saw tears on more than a few faces. Sarah was crying openly, even gruff Tom was wiping at his eyes, and Mrs. Henderson was beaming like a proud mother. They walked back down the aisle together as husband and wife, and this time Lydia didn't look at the crowd with fear or defiance. She looked at them with gratitude for those who'd supported them, and even for those who'd doubted, because their doubt had forced her and Ethan to be absolutely certain of their choice. The celebration that followed was warm and genuine. Tables were laden with food, roasted venison and fresh bread, vegetables from various gardens, pies and cakes and preserves. Someone produced a fiddle, another a guitar, and soon music filled the clearing. People danced and ate and drank, the initial awkwardness giving way to genuine celebration. Ethan pulled Lydia into a dance, and they moved together easily, naturally, having found their rhythm over months of working side by side. "Happy?" he asked. "Terrified and happy in equal measure? Good terrified or bad terrified?" "Good, I think. The kind of terrified that comes with starting something new and not knowing how it will turn out but wanting to find out anyway." She rested her head against his shoulder. "Ask me again in a year if I made the right choice." "I already know you did." "Confident, aren't you?" "About this? About us?" "Yes." He spun her gently. "I've never been more sure of anything." As the sun began to lower toward the western peaks, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, Mrs. Pemberton approached them. She was the boarding house owner who'd made the most pointed comments about propriety, and Lydia braced herself for whatever cutting remark was coming. But the older woman's expression was softer than Lydia had ever seen it. "I owe you both an apology," she said without preamble. "I was harsh in my judgment, but watching you today, seeing how you look at each other, I was wrong. This isn't scandal or opportunism. This is two people finding comfort and love in the wake of tragedy, and that's something to celebrate, not condemn." Lydia felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you. That means more than you know." "Take care of each other," Mrs. Pemberton said, squeezing Lydia's hand. "That's all any of us can do in this hard world. Take care of each other." As evening fell and the celebration began to wind down, people started drifting away with promises to visit and invitations to future gatherings. Sarah hugged Lydia fiercely before she left. "You deserve this happiness," she whispered. "Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Finally, as the last wagon rolled away and the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Ethan and Lydia were alone. They stood together in the clearing, surrounded by the remains of the celebration, and looked at each other in the gathering dusk. "Well," Lydia said, "here we are. Here we are." Ethan took her hand. "Come with me. I have something to show you." He led her not toward the cabin, but toward Clara's grave. Lydia tensed for a moment, uncertain, but trusted him enough to follow. When they reached the clearing, she saw that someone, Ethan, she realized, had placed a fresh bouquet of wildflowers on the grave, the same mix of lupine and Indian paintbrush that had decorated their wedding arch. "I wanted to bring you here," Ethan said. "Before we start our life together as husband and wife, I wanted to stand here with you and acknowledge that Clara is part of our story, that she always will be, not as a shadow or a source of guilt, but as someone we both loved, who brought us together." Lydia's throat was tight. "I've been so worried about dishonoring her memory." "I know, so have I. But standing here now, I don't feel like we've betrayed her. I feel like we've honored her. We kept her garden alive. We've made the homestead thrive. We've taken the grief she left behind and transformed it into something new and good." Ethan turned to face Lydia fully. "She would have wanted that, for both of us." "How can you be so sure?" "Because love doesn't work like that. Real love doesn't demand eternal mourning or ask the living to stop living. Real love wants happiness for the people it touches, even after it's gone." He gestured to the grave. "Clara loved us both. She'd want us to be happy. And if that happiness came from finding each other, she'd celebrate it, not resent it." Lydia looked at this grave, at the wooden cross with her sister's name carved into it, at the flowers they'd brought. She thought about all the conversations she'd had here, all the permission she'd sought from someone who couldn't answer. But maybe she'd been looking for the wrong thing. Maybe the permission she needed wasn't Clara's. Maybe it was her own. "I forgive myself," Lydia said aloud, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. "For not visiting when Clara invited me. For being too busy with my own life to make time for her. For surviving when she didn't. For falling in love with her husband. I forgive myself for all of it." The relief that washed through her was profound. She hadn't realized how much guilt she'd been carrying, how much she'd been punishing herself for choices made and opportunities missed. Ethan wrapped his arms around her from behind. "She forgives you too. I know she does." They stood there for a long moment as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Then, together, they turned and walked back to the cabin. Their cabin now, in a way it hadn't been before. Inside, Ethan lit the lamps while Lydia changed out of the wedding dress and into something more practical. When she came back downstairs, he'd laid out a simple supper, bread and cheese and some of the wedding cake Sarah had insisted they keep. "Not much of a wedding feast," he said apologetically. "It's perfect." Lydia sat beside him at the table. Everything today was perfect. They ate quietly, both exhausted from the emotions and activity of the day. When they finished, Ethan stood and held out his hand. "Come to bed, wife." The word sent a shiver through her. Wife, a title she'd never expected to claim, certainly not like this. But it felt right. She took his hand and let him lead her to the bed they would now share, not as housemates or friends, but as husband and wife. That night, in the privacy of their cabin, they came together with tenderness and care, learning each other in a new way. And if there were moments when grief touched the edges of their joy, they acknowledged it without shame. This was how healing worked, not by forgetting the past, but by building a future that honored it while moving forward. The first months of marriage were an adjustment. Living together as a couple was different from living together as reluctant housemates. They had to learn each other's rhythms, navigate small conflicts, figure out how to share space in a new way. Lydia discovered that Ethan was grumpy in the mornings until he'd had coffee, that he had an irrational hatred of reorganizing the barn even though it desperately needed it, that he talked to the animals when he thought no one was listening. Ethan learned that Lydia needed an hour alone with her books each evening to feel balanced, that she had strong opinions about the correct way to stack firewood, that she sang off-key while cooking and got defensive if anyone pointed it out. They fought sometimes, over trivial things mostly, like how to preserve the tomatoes or whether to sell the extra vegetables in town or trade them with neighbors. But they learned to fight fair, to apologize when wrong, to choose their battles. And slowly, the cabin that had been Clara's and then a shared space of grief became theirs. They added new touches: a second rocking chair on the porch, new curtains Lydia sewed, a larger bookshelf to accommodate both their collections. They created new traditions, new rhythms, new memories that were theirs alone. Winter came early that year, bringing heavy snows that isolated them for weeks at a time. But the cabin was warm and well-stocked, and Lydia found she didn't mind the isolation. These quiet months gave them time to truly settle into their marriage, to learn each other without the pressure of work or social obligations. One evening in January, almost exactly a year after Clara's death, Lydia realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but hadn't said anything, wanting to be certain. But as she sat by the fire mending one of Ethan's shirts, the truth was undeniable. New life was growing inside her, a child who would be both hers and Ethan's, who would carry both Clara's legacy and create their own. "Ethan," she said, setting down her mending. He looked up from the harness he was repairing. "Yeah?" "I have something to tell you." She took a breath. "I'm pregnant." The harness fell from his hands. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be. 2 months along, I think." Ethan crossed the cabin in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. When he finally pulled back, there were tears on his face. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We're having a baby. Are you happy?" Happy doesn't begin to cover it. He placed a hand gently on her still flat stomach, terrified and happy and grateful and amazed all at once. Lydia covered his hand with her own. "Me too. All of those things." They told the neighbors a few weeks later, and the response was overwhelmingly positive. Even those who'd been skeptical about the marriage seemed to view the pregnancy as a benediction, proof that this union was meant to be. Sarah Garrett immediately began knitting tiny clothes. Mrs. Henderson started collecting advice and remedies for pregnancy ailments. Tom built a cradle in his workshop, refusing any payment and insisting it was his gift to the new family. As Lydia's belly grew through the spring and summer, she found herself thinking often about Clara, about how her sister would have been an aunt, how she would have spoiled this child and told it embarrassing stories about both its parents. The sadness of that loss was real, but it no longer overwhelmed everything else. It was just one thread in the larger tapestry of their lives. She visited the grave regularly, talking to Clara about the pregnancy, about her fears and excitement, about how Ethan was already planning additions to the cabin to make room for the baby. "You'd laugh at how nervous he is," Lydia said one afternoon, sitting on the grass beside the grave with her hand on her swollen belly. He's read every book on childbirth he could find. He's more prepared than I am." The baby kicked, strong and insistent, and Lydia smiled. "Your niece or nephew is going to be stubborn, I can already tell. Takes after both sides of the family." She paused, watching clouds drift over the mountain peaks. "I wish you could meet them. I wish you could see what we've built here, how the garden flourished again this year, how the homestead is thriving. I wish you could see that I'm happy, that Ethan's happy, that we've made something good from the grief you left behind." The baby kicked again, and Lydia took it as agreement. Labor came in late August, on a day so hot even the mountains seemed to shimmer with heat. Sarah and Mrs. Henderson were there, having moved into the cabin weeks earlier to wait for the baby's arrival. Ethan paced the porch, banned from the cabin by the women who insisted he'd just get in the way. It was long and painful and terrifying, but when Lydia finally held her daughter, because it was a daughter, red-faced and howling and perfect, every moment of fear and pain was forgotten. "A girl," Sarah announced, opening the cabin door to where Ethan stood anxiously waiting. "You have a daughter." Ethan rushed inside to find Lydia propped up in bed, exhausted and radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of Clara's quilts. "Come meet your daughter," Lydia said, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. Ethan sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at the infant. She'd stopped crying and was staring up at them with unfocused eyes, her tiny fist waving in the air. "She's perfect," he breathed. "She's absolutely perfect." "What should we name her?" Lydia asked. They'd discussed names, but never quite decided. Ethan was quiet for a moment, studying his daughter's face. "What about Clara? To honor your sister?" Lydia's eyes filled with tears. She'd hoped he would suggest it, but hadn't wanted to ask. "Clara Lydia Mercer? Perfect." Ethan kissed first the baby's forehead, then Lydia's. "Hello, Clara. Welcome home." The first year with baby Clara was exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Sleepless nights and endless feedings, first smiles and tiny hands gripping their fingers, the constant worry that came with being responsible for such a fragile life. But through it all, Ethan and Lydia grew stronger as partners. They took turns walking the floor with a crying baby, supported each other through the difficult moments, celebrated every small milestone together. The homestead continued to thrive. With Ethan's hard work and Lydia's careful planning, they expanded the garden, improved the barn, added a room to the cabin for the baby. They were building something lasting, something that would endure beyond them. One evening, when Clara was 6 months old and sleeping peacefully in the cradle Tom had made, Lydia and Ethan sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. "Do you ever think about how strange it is?" Lydia asked. "How we got here?" "Every day." Ethan took her hand. "If you'd told me 2 years ago that I'd be sitting here with you, married, with a daughter, I would have thought you were crazy. 2 years ago, I was in Philadelphia teaching grammar to ungrateful girls and trying to convince myself I was happy. Are you happy now?" Lydia considered the question seriously, as she considered most things. She thought about the hard work and the isolation, the judgment they'd faced and the grief they'd carried. She thought about the calluses on her hands and the ache in her back from carrying a baby while doing farm work. She thought about everything this life demanded and how far she was from the comfortable existence she'd once known. "Yes," she said finally, "I'm happy. Not in the way I imagined happiness when I was young, but in a deeper, more real way. This life is hard, but it's ours. We built it together from loss and grief, and that makes it precious. Even with the gossip, the judgment, even with that. People have mostly come around, you know, and those who haven't, well, their opinions don't define us." She squeezed his hand. "We define us." Ethan pulled her close, and they sat in comfortable silence as the sky deepened from gold to purple to the deep blue of twilight. Inside, the baby stirred and made small noises but didn't wake. "I love you," Ethan said. "I don't say it enough, but I love you. Not as a replacement for Clara or a way to avoid grief, but for exactly who you are. For your stubbornness and your strength and your terrible singing and everything else." Lydia laughed. "I love you too. Even when you're grumpy before coffee and refuse to reorganize the barn and talk to the chickens like they're people. They are people. Chicken people. That's not a thing. It is in my barn. They were still laughing when they went inside, checking on the sleeping baby one more time before climbing into bed together. Outside, the stars blazed in the clear mountain sky, the same stars that had watched Clara's burial and Lydia's arrival and their wedding and the birth of their daughter. The same stars that would watch over whatever came next. Because there would be more to come, more seasons, more challenges, more joy and grief mixed together in the complicated way of life. But they would face it together, these two people who'd found each other in the worst of circumstances and built something beautiful from the ruins. Years later, when little Clara was old enough to ask questions, Lydia would take her to the grave on the hillside and tell her about the aunt she'd been named for, about how Aunt Clara had loved this valley and this cabin, how she'd planted the garden they still tended, how she'd brought together the two people who would become the girl's parents. "Did Aunt Clara know about me?" the child would ask. "No, sweetheart. She died before you were born. But she would have loved me, right? She would have loved you more than anything." And Lydia would mean it, knowing with absolute certainty that Clara would have adored this fierce, curious child with her father's quiet strength and her mother's stubborn determination. But that was still to come. For now, on this perfect autumn evening with their daughter sleeping peacefully and the homestead thriving around them, Ethan and Lydia were content to simply be, to have survived grief and found love, to have built a life that honored the past while embracing the future. The cabin was full again, not with Clara's particular light, but with a different kind of warmth. A warmth created by two people who'd been broken by loss and had somehow put each other back together, not quite the same as they'd been before, but maybe better for the breaking and the mending. As Ethan drifted off to sleep beside her, Lydia thought about all the twists and turns that had brought them to this moment. The fever that took Clara, the letter that brought Lydia west, the long months of grief and work and slowly growing love, the judgment they'd faced and overcome, the daughter sleeping in the next room. None of it had been easy, some of it had been nearly unbearable, but all of it had been necessary to bring them here, to this quiet moment of peace and contentment. "Thank you," Lydia whispered into the darkness, not quite sure if she was talking to Clara or fate or the universe itself. "Thank you for all of it." And outside, the wind moved through the aspen trees with a sound like gentle laughter, carrying her gratitude up into the star-filled sky, across the mountains, into whatever mysteries lay beyond. The cowboy had lost his wife to fever. Her sister had come to help and stayed to love. And from that loss, they'd built a life, hard-won and precious, and entirely their own. A life that would continue, season after season, year after year, rooted in these mountains they called home. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.